And I'm going to start by just giving a little introduction to the series as a whole before passing over to my colleagues who've been individual volume editors. And the first that I heard about this idea was when I was having a coffee with Gail, and Gail said, it's about time I actually did something about that decades idea. And I think, Gail, it's something you've been thinking about for a while.
I had, and then we were approached by Linda Bree, who'd also had the idea.
Yes.
And we thought, oh, we better do something. We really had better do something.
There was this moment where it suddenly all came together, and then with the incredible help of Bethany and the team at CUP, and with the help of our colleague Andy Stover, who's in the US, which is why he can't be with us today, this has come together over the last few years. I'm not quite sure how many years at this
Quite
point.
a few years.
So the idea behind this series was very much, as Bethany was saying, to challenge and undo some of those slightly glib characterizations of the decades. And because my colleague's going to talk about the 1830s and the 1850s, I thought I'd say a little bit about the 90s, which, as we know, has been known as the naughty 90s. But this volume really starts to unravel that simple characterization by showing the complexity of that decade, which in the introduction, Dustin Friedman and Kristen Mahoney call it the 1890s, a decade of 1,000 movements. And our aim with the whole series was not just to replace one characterization by another characterization, but to actually allow some of those tensions and contradictions and the complexity of taking this slice of a decade to come through. And also not just to update and reflect the scholarship and the scholarly currents that have been coming through in recent years, but also to try and look forward a bit and start to probe in directions that we thought would become very interesting for the next few years. So you can see, again, using this volume as an example, thinking about the green 1890s, not just as the green carnation, the ultimate in artifice, but green in relation to ecology and environmentalism, and all of those issues that seem anathema to the artifice that we associate with decadence. And also conservatism. So we've got chapters here on socialism, conservatism, as well, of course, as decadence and environmentalism, and all of these other concepts that come together in this incredibly rich way when you start to look at these things synchronically. So that was, in key part, the aim of the series, and I've always described it a bit as a botanist's square, where the botanist puts down a square and then just sees what's there. And instead of trying to create some kind of totalizing, nice narrative that will take you through, we're allowing those tensions to come forward and allowing those to play with each other a little bit. Because ultimately, a decade is an arbitrary slice of time. But the fascinating thing, of course, is that this was the century in which it became not an arbitrary slice of time, because people started to think about their lives in terms of decades and centuries. And it's a point, I think, nicely made by the editors of this 1890s volume, that by the end of the century, people were thinking about the century as a lived experience, as a lived unit of experience. So they're talking about how much the prefix new came into being in the 1890s, the new woman, new fiction, new hedonism, new drama. So it's a particularly interesting century to think about in terms of these chronological markers that in one sense started off being fairly arbitrary markers, but then become absolutely kind of lived and experienced, parts of people's actual personal narratives. So I think the last thing I want to say in terms of the interest of doing this as a project was actually something that came out I wrote a chapter for the 1860s volume, and that chapter was on Palgrave's Golden Treasury. I don't think it allowed me to think about that collection, not as in terms of so much the poetry within it, but what it was as a cultural artifact and how it reverberated culturally through the rest of the century. And thinking about literature within this rich cultural context, and thinking about literature as part of the warp and weft of the cultural fabric of the decade, I think has given us all a different way in to thinking and talking about literature. I see that coming out in many of the contributions through the series. So I think it's unleashed a sort of rather different way of coming at some of the works, literary works, that we might be very familiar with through other frames. It's given a different way into this. That's all I want to say by way of introduction, but let's move on to the 1830s.
Okay, well, maybe I could start by saying a few things about how we saw the decades before, and I guess how that's maybe changed in terms of our editing. When John and I were asked to do this, I said that we've been approached to do this, it's really exciting. And he said, oh, you've got the hard decade, the 1830s.
Yeah.
And I think in a way it's the opposite of the 1890s, which has got a characteristic which is there already, and you might want to complicate that. The 30s, we say it in the introduction, often seems like an awkward silence between two exciting conversations, the Romantic and the Victorian. And one of the first things that John and I did was just said, well, okay, what did happen? And we kind of came up with this big list of events and things, and those events were literary, but also political, historical. That the Jamaica Rising in the early 1830s gives that sense of the global quality of the 30s, but also how much print and discussion was generated by it. And I think that sense of noise and contention was maybe one of the big things we wanted to capture in the volume.
For sure. I mean, it is seen as the decade where nothing really happens, and yet it's the decade that begins with the government falling, first time since 1708. The new Bourbon police force, 1829. One king dies, there's another new king. And it's a decade that ends with the first Anglo-Chinese War, the first Opium War, in 1839. And Peter Kitson, who's here, writes about how the comic novelist Thomas Love Peacock was instrumental in creating gunboats, iron warships for that. So we found that decade quite easily because it starts and ends in the threat of violence. I mean, 1831, as E.P. Thompson pointed out, was the year where we came closest to a revolution in this country. The 2 years are 1819 and 31. And one of the main differences between the two is technology and what we talk about in the period. If you look at the insurrections of 1819, they're using pikes and very few weapons. If you look at 1831, they're looking at using steamships. If you read Macaroni or Benbow, and they're looking at actually stealing things from the factories that they work in to make weapons and bombs. So it's a very, very noisy decade. And I think by following the technology, whether it was photography or science, if we think about Adeline Buckland's essay on women geologists, no, that was missing from there. That was important for us to pick up on that, and it really led us to the photograph in the cover. Louis Daguerre's Paris Boulevard, at 8 o'clock in the morning, 1838, the first fixed picture of human beings. And it shows the class system in action, very conveniently. It shows you somebody who stood still long enough to get his shoes shined. It's just here. And then the first criticisms of this photograph, which doesn't exist now, it was cleaned by a Munich art gallery in 1974 and destroyed. All we have are copies of this image. And I'm very grateful to CUP for paying for it and allowing us to have it. Thank you. Because it's integral to the introduction. What you can see here are two people, someone getting his shoes shined and somebody shining shoes that stood long enough for that maybe 8 minutes of that photograph. But what is missing are all the hundreds of people, all the animals, all the carts, all the other people that were on that street that never stood still long enough to be captured. And I think that's one of the things about doing something in decades. What you're seeing is always something partial, something very small. And it's up to us to try and uncover as much as we can from that. And that was an important thing for us.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's been a real pleasure for us, I think, as editors to do it, because we came in with some ideas about what we wanted to discover and things that we kind of didn't want to emphasise. But it was our contributors who really kind of opened our eyes to the amount of activity that was going on, and also that central idea that people were thinking about the decade as something that was happening and something that was different. And I think one of the things we liked was that the word transition, which is of course in the series title, is an important word at the start of the decade. That J.S. Mill uses it, Edward Bulwer Lytton uses it, and they're worried about how to capture this moment and that feeling that something's different from what went before. And that's partly a lot of writers. Byron, Scott dies in 32, Austen is dead, and there's a emerging sense of the romantic. It hasn't been named yet, but there's a sense that something inchoate is beginning to happen. And what our contributors really brought out for us was cultural forms are constantly being developed that try and take the pulse of that sense of uncertainty and that sense of not being quite sure what's happening and not quite knowing where the future is going to lead to. So it felt to us that the 30s, when we start adding up, like, well, literary forms, but also things like lithography, the daguerreotypes, looking at poetics, but also short fiction, periodical writing became really important for us as well. All of them were trying to kind of capture a pulse that's moving unpredictably. So it became, I suppose, we could start thinking of the 30s as a central pivot rather than an absence.
And full of things that didn't have names. I think Jenny Green-Lewis's essay on the daguerreotype and the talbotypes, they still never had the name photography. That to be arrived, the technology is there before the label is there at the same time. And that was... So that was good. And I think to mention the lithograph again, I mean, that was Brian Maidment, who just died earlier this year, sadly, and much missed. What a brilliant mind. And what a great reader of illustrations. And, Brian concentrates on the lithograph here, and this is a kind of new technology. You can see it in the 20s and 30s, but then it gives way to the woodcut again. It doesn't stick. Punch takes up the wood engraving afterwards. So you get these competing technologies in the 30s, and what's going to stick, and what will it be called, and what will be left?
Yeah. So I suppose it helped us think a little bit about literary genealogy slightly differently. And Dickens, we didn't intend this, but Dickens really is. He's sort of everywhere. And we sort of expected it, and we didn't want it, but, he muscled his way in, and there he is in lots of the chapters. But equally, there are other kind of genealogies that start making sense. You think about how important photography is to us today. Obviously, Daguerre can't have anticipated that, but it needed to happen then, and it kind of filled a cultural need at that time, and you start rethinking what literary or cultural genealogies look like.
I think the chapters in Dickens were a bit unexpected in a way. I mean, we kind of thought, right, we don't want the young Dickens, we don't want the young Tennyson, that's what's expected. We want to do other things. And then, as you say, a few of the chapters indeed do that. But they do different things. I mean, John Strachan's essay on sporting journalism in Dickens is very fine, and it does new things. We've got Dickens Society members here. Sambuddha Sen's essay on the sketch and the importance of the sketch in the 30s, again, a really terrific essay. I think that builds on Greg Dart's work on Cockneys in the 30s and 40s as well. Really strong work there. So, the Dickens stuff was still surprising that came through. Yeah.
I'd say one thing I just wanted to sort of thank our series editors for is that what they did was set up meetings online where we could all come together and talk about the series, and that really helped us think about what the decade meant. It was such a good model of how collaborative work can work, and it's something we tried to replicate with our contributors as well. And so I think a perfect example of that would be Valerie Sanders' chapter, which is a great piece on Harriet Martineau, but she changed her focus slightly to introduce some work that Martineau did on Demerara and Ireland, because so many of our other contributors were thinking about settler colonialism in particular, and that we all ended up talking to each other. Those Zoom meetings were wonderful because we had people in Washington State, Ontario, we had people in Delhi, we had people in Melbourne. Some people it was about midnight, others it was about 6 in the morning. But that was, I suppose that's how collaboration works. It was a pleasure.
No, it really was. It worked well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry, we talked too much.
The one thing I was going to say, Gail, was when we came up with when we showed, and I'd mentioned this to you earlier, a proposal for this, and somebody had said, but that's not literature. That's not literature. And it's like, no, it is. It is. It's just where literature might want to look now. We can apply our English literature superpowers of close reading to these other kinds of texts and other things. And so it's a very promiscuous book as far as English literature goes. It goes into lots of areas that literature maybe wasn't expected to go to as well. And that was nice. That was good.
I think all the volumes do that.
Yeah.
Particularly, which is absolutely terrific. Okay, 1850s. I came at this from a slightly different perspective in that I've been spending far too long, as some people in the room know, on 1859. So for me, a decade was actually opening out quite extraordinarily. So I think that probably made a difference to how I came to it in the first place. In terms of thinking about the 50s then, before I got going on the book, I was thinking, I've always been fascinated by the fact that In Memoriam and The Prelude both appeared in 1850. That still seems to me quite extraordinary. They're such different texts, looking backwards and forwards in that 1 year. So I was really keen to think a bit more about that. I was also very conscious that the decade's book ended by the Great Exhibition in 1851, by Darwin, Origin of Species, and lots of other things in 1859. So tracking that trajectory was going to be challenging and interesting. We're probably also all aware of the age of equipoise that obviously Byrne talks about a lot. I think that's kind of accepted, or it's entered a kind of critical consciousness. So that was something really to really think about, to critique, to try and pull apart. And it's also a decade, of course, and lots of the big Victorian writers get going, get themselves established. Dickens is there. Actually, Dickens isn't in the book very much, actually, which is interesting. But Eliot gets going, Wilkie Collins. Lots of people's careers take off in that, what feels like an archetypally Victorian decade in lots of ways. So what we had to do, I think, was to pull apart what that actually meant, and also particularly to think about London as a kind of centre. So in a way, what we did was to organise the book around this idea of London as a centre and to move out from that. But in that moving out, to really question whether London was a centre or not, what made it a centre, and how stable, in fact, that positioning could be or ever was. Was it something the Victorians experienced? Was it something that we'd retrospectively imposed on that particular centre of empire? So I think what the book does is to draw attention to a range of different experiences, different technologies, different texts, and really to sort of pull apart quite a lot of the things that we'd experienced and thought about. I think particularly the notion of equipoise. What I think the book's given me is a sense of how much of a struggle it is to achieve equilibrium and equipoise. If it is an age of equipoise, it's because there are lots of struggles and battles going on to achieve something that feels stable at the centre. And of course the tensions there are the most interesting thing about that decade. It's a decade of war, and that comes through very strongly in the book. It's the first time for a long time that there have been international wars like the Crimea, like the Indian Uprising. There are lots of smaller battles, of course, and lots of violence between the start of the century and the 1850s. But it's a period that is really marked by an experience of war. And I think by very tangible things like military men, wounded men being very visible on the streets of towns and cities. And I think that also adds to a sense of challenging masculinity in the 1850s, which comes through in quite tangential ways, but it's definitely there as a marker in the book. Particularly, I think, in one of the most interesting essays, which is about the Royal Geographical Society and explorers getting lost, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. We can also see, I think, something that John and David talked about as well, a huge new availability of many, many different kinds of text. There's a repeal of a paper tax in 1855, and after that, an extraordinary awareness and availability of printed matter for more and more people, which I think adds to the excitement and the vitality of that decade. So I think that all begins to kind of construct an idea of a very vociferous kind of literary legacy, if the decade gives us a legacy at all. And it's very much a decade, I think, that has a very metropolitan feel to it. That came through very, very, very clearly in lots of the essays we've been looking at. People travelling, but also travelling through the literature they're reading, through really engendering a really interesting kind of cosmopolitanism, which I think we might forget about the Victorian period, and particularly the mid-Victorian period. So we've got explorers, we've got lots of scientists, we've got some inherent instability, I think, in geographical and geopolitical formations. India, obviously, is one of the major things that kind of underpins that sense. But also, I think the Crimea, which is a major conflict, a very destabilising conflict, not least because England was fighting on the same side as France, which is, for England at the time, was difficult. But it has extraordinary repercussions, which really go throughout this decade and absolutely into the 1860s. So we're looking at, the essays are looking at those conflicts, but they're also looking towards the end of the book at things which seem perhaps more familiar, perhaps over-familiar. So terms like Christian heroism, thinking about transport, the working classes, about marriage and realism, things which seem quite solid and stable, but which, again, are being contested in the essays that we're looking at. So we're really reevaluating, revaluing innovations and things that seemed a bit more stable. So I think the volume as a whole is kind of unpicking the process of equipoise and retrieving some suppressed voices and views, whilst thinking about what it actually means to be in a period of change or transition. And I think transition is I've come to really value that word, I think, the more we've thought about it. And I was thinking this afternoon, I was jotting down a few ideas as to what to say, just remembering marking undergraduate essays, which many people in the room have done, I'm sure. The Victorian period is a period of great change. Okay, but every period is a period of great change, so it's not quite worth saying. But actually, if you think about it as a period of transition, and of course every period is also a period of transition, but it does keep that notion of change in the air. Transition is something that's sort of ever present, isn't it? As indeed change is, but there's no way in which transition ever quite finishes. And I think we probably got a sense of how that works across the series as a whole, because not only were individual contributors talking within volumes, but I think the volumes speak to each other in really interesting ways too. I know certainly the 1860s very fortuitously came up before my 1850s did, so I could look ahead to where we were going, and that was really helpful. I think in terms of this series as a whole, we were thinking that we might hubristically try to kind of future-proof it as much as possible. So we're not just thinking about what's going on now, but trying to anticipate some movements and interests that people might have in the next few years. So as well as being very aware of decolonising, which was around in the earlier part of our years working on the series, we're also thinking about greening the curriculum too. So lots of the volumes have really interesting eco work. But I think we're also very conscious that we wanted to make the best use of the data that's available to us and think about the ways in which that data and its ever greater availability makes lots of things possible, how it reshapes our work. So we wanted to be really self-conscious about that too. And one of the things that's also struck me in thinking about this is actually how the process of this works. So we did have Zoom meetings, which I think a few years ago we wouldn't have bothered about really with this kind of series and these sorts of books. And it has meant, I think, that contributors, volumes really self-consciously talk to each other now, and we collaborate differently, we share differently, and I think that's been a real strength of this series. David came up with a few ideas for things we might think about, what the best discovery was of the different books that we've been editing. And I think the thing that I like, I enjoy doing my own essays, but I think the essay that really stood out for me as really representing what literary skills, what critical reading, close reading can do, is a fantastic essay by Jessica Howell, which is called Finding the Lost, the Royal Geographical Society and Discourses of Obligatory African Travel, where she goes into the archives of the Royal Geographical Society and she's investigating the stories of lost explorers, famously Livingstone, of course, but there are many. It seems like lost explorers just got lost anyway, but there has to be a kind of narrative about finding them, retrieving them, and turning that into a kind of heroic narrative. So retrieving the lost and making it great again. But what Jessica found when she dug around in the archives was, of course, that lots of the finding of the explorers and indeed their journeys in the first place were based on indigenous knowledge, which has been excluded, occluded, appropriated, and by really digging forensically, reading forensically across the RGS archive, she's not only retrieved those indigenous voices, but has actually shown how the archive itself is a measure of political control, how the archive itself is part of the violence of colonialism. It's a tremendous piece of work, so do buy the 1850s one, you can read it yourselves. But I just thought that's a really fantastic example of what we can do as literary scholars, and I think of what this series is doing, and in delving down, really delving deep into small examples which then explode out into really important insights about the period.